Welcome to Slumbertainment. Get comfortable, close your eyes, and let yourself relax. Tonight we examine the mystery of Bigfoot. Please like and subscribe for more restful content. Now, let's begin. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a forest at dusk. The light changes slowly, filtering through branches in long amber shafts before it fades entirely. The sounds shift. Birdsong gives way to the low rustle of wind through leaves, and somewhere deeper in the trees, something moves. A branch snaps. A shadow passes between the trunks, and then silence again. For as long as human beings have lived near forests, they have sensed something watching from within them. Not always with fear, and not always with certainty, but with that particular feeling that the wilderness holds things beyond what can be easily named or explained. It is a feeling that has followed people across centuries and continents, and in North America, it has coalesced around a single enduring figure. Most people know the name Bigfoot, sometimes called Sasquatch, a creature described by thousands of witnesses across more than a century as something between the familiar and the impossible. Tall, far taller than any human being, covered in dark hair, walking upright through the forests of the Pacific Northwest, the Appalachian foothills, the dense wilderness of the American and Canadian interior, leaving behind footprints pressed deep into soft earth and then vanishing as if the trees themselves had swallowed it whole. This is not a story about monsters. It is not a story about fear. It is instead a story about one of the most persistent and genuinely puzzling mysteries in modern history. A mystery that has drawn scientists, researchers, filmmakers, and ordinary people into the woods for decades, searching for something they cannot quite name but cannot quite dismiss. The question of Bigfoot is, in many ways, the question of what we are willing to believe. And perhaps more interestingly, it is the question of what we are willing to admit we do not know. To understand how a creature like Bigfoot became lodged so deeply in the American imagination, it helps to consider what North America looked like not so long ago in geological terms. Much of the continent was, until relatively recently in human history, a vast and largely uncharted wilderness. Even as towns and cities grew along the coasts and river valleys, enormous stretches of forest remained untouched and unexplored. The forests of the Pacific Northwest alone, stretching from northern California up through Oregon and Washington, into British Columbia and beyond, cover millions of acres of some of the most rugged and remote terrain on Earth. These are not gentle woodlands. The old-growth forests of the Northwest are ancient places, dense with Douglas fir and Sitka spruce, their canopies so thick that midday light barely reaches the forest floor. Ravines cut through the landscape without warning. Fog rolls in from the coast and lingers for days. Rivers run fast and cold. It is, by any measure, the kind of place where something large could move without being seen, where the land itself seems designed to conceal. It is also, not coincidentally, the place most associated with Bigfoot sightings. The word Sasquatch comes from the Halkomelem language, spoken by indigenous peoples of the Fraser Valley region of British Columbia. The word, roughly translating to wild man, was documented in the early 20th century by a Canadian journalist named John Burns, who compiled accounts from local indigenous communities describing large, hair-covered beings living in the mountains and forests. Burns popularized the term in a series of articles, and it entered wider circulation from there. But the idea the word describes is far older. Indigenous nations across North America have their own names and their own traditions surrounding beings that resemble what we now call Bigfoot. The Lummi people of the Pacific Northwest speak of the Tsemekwes. The Lakota have accounts of the Chiatanka, sometimes translated as Big Elder Brother. The Sitsails First Nation of British Columbia consider the Sasquatch, their version of the figure, to be a deeply spiritual presence, not simply an animal, but something more complex and more meaningful. These traditions are not uniform. Different nations describe different beings with different qualities. Some are solitary, some travel in groups, some are shy and elusive. Others are said to be capable of communication with human beings. What they share is a sense of deep familiarity. These are not new discoveries, not creatures glimpsed once and then forgotten. They are presences woven into the fabric of the land itself, acknowledged across generations as something real, something that belongs to the forest in a way that human beings do not. Western settlers, arriving with different frameworks for understanding the natural world, were slower to accept these accounts. But even among early European explorers and fur traders, stories began to accumulate. Journals from the 1800s describe encounters with large unknown creatures in the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. Trappers spoke of tracks too large to belong to any bear. Logging crews reported strange sounds in the night, low, resonant calls that carried through the trees without any identifiable source. These accounts were mostly private, passed between men around campfires, or written in personal journals that would not surface until decades later. There was little incentive in those years to report such things publicly. The wilderness was full of dangers and uncertainties, and a man who claimed to have seen something impossible risked being dismissed entirely. What changed in the 20th century was not the sightings themselves. Those continued at a fairly steady rate, but the technology and the culture surrounding them. Cameras became affordable. Newspapers reached wider audiences, and as North America urbanized, the wilderness began to feel more distant, more mysterious, and perhaps more capable of holding secrets. By the middle of the 20th century, the idea of Bigfoot had begun to take shape as something more than regional folklore. It was becoming a national curiosity, something discussed not just in remote logging towns, but in living rooms and newsrooms across the country, something that people wanted to understand. And in 1958, an event occurred in a remote corner of Northern California that would change everything. A road crew working in the wilderness near Bluff Creek discovered something they could not explain. A set of footprints pressed into the soft earth alongside a construction site that measured nearly 16 inches long. The prints were human in shape, but inhuman in scale. They suggested a creature walking upright, with a stride far longer than any man. The story reached a local newspaper. The newspaper ran it, and from that moment, the modern era of Bigfoot began. Whatever was out there, whatever had been moving through those forests for longer than anyone could say, had finally left a mark that the wider world could not ignore. Long before there were newspapers or cameras or researchers with plaster casting kits, there were stories. Passed from one generation to the next, told around fires and in longhouses, and on the edges of forests that stretched further than any single person could travel in a lifetime. These stories were not entertainment in the way we tend to think of it now. They were records. They were instruction. They were a way of understanding the world and communicating that understanding to those who would come after. Among many indigenous nations of North America, stories of large, hair-covered beings living in the wilderness are among the oldest in their oral traditions. They predate European contact by centuries, possibly millennia, and while it would be a mistake to flatten the enormous diversity of these traditions into a single narrative, each nation has its own language, its own cosmology, its own relationship with the land. It is worth spending time with some of these accounts, not to extract them from their original context, but to understand what they suggest about the deep history of this mystery. The Sales First Nation of British Columbia occupies a stretch of land along the Harrison River, east of Vancouver. For the Sasquatch people, the Sasquatch, the being that would eventually become known in English as Sasquatch, is not simply a creature of the forest. It is a powerful spiritual presence, one that exists at the boundary between the human world and something beyond it. In Sasquatch tradition, the Sasquatch is capable of rendering itself invisible to those it does not wish to be seen by. It moves between worlds in ways that ordinary animals do not. This is not a detail that outside researchers have always known what to do with. It does not fit neatly into the framework of zoology or cryptozoology, the study of animals whose existence has not been formally confirmed. But for the Sasquatch, it is central to understanding what the Sasquatch actually is. It is not merely a large primate hiding in the trees. It is something with intention, something with awareness. Hereditary Chief Clarence Penier of the Sasquatch Nation has spoken publicly about the importance of treating the Sasquatch with respect, of understanding that encounters with this being are not random but meaningful, that the forest is not simply a habitat but a place governed by relationships that human beings do not fully control. Further south, among the Coast Salish peoples of what is now Washington State, similar traditions exist. The Lumi Nation speaks of the Tsemekwes, tall, powerfully built, human-like beings who live deep in the mountains. Accounts describe them as generally peaceful, but capable of great strength when threatened. They are said to have their own social structures, their own ways of moving through the land. They are not mindless or savage. They are, in a sense, neighbours, occupying the same territory as human communities, but moving through it on different terms. Among the Lakota of the Great Plains, the figure known as Chiatanka, sometimes translated as Big Elder Brother, carries a different character. Here the being is associated with wisdom and spiritual power, sometimes appearing to individuals at significant moments in their lives. It is less a creature of the deep wilderness and more a presence that moves through the world with specific purpose. The Iroquois nations of the northeastern woodlands have their own traditions, as do the Algonquin peoples of the Great Lakes region, the Cherokee of the southern Appalachians, and many others. The specifics vary enormously. What they share is the sense that the wilderness is not empty, that it is inhabited by presences older and more mysterious than anything that can be easily catalogued. Western scholars and settlers who first encountered these traditions tended to interpret them in one of two ways. Some dismissed them as mythology, colourful stories that reflected the fears and imaginings of pre-scientific cultures but had no bearing on the physical world. Others, particularly those who spent significant time in the wilderness themselves, were more cautious. They had heard too many similar accounts from too many unconnected sources to dismiss them entirely. One of the earliest documented Western accounts of a Bigfoot-like creature comes from a Spanish expedition along the coast of California in 1776. The expedition's diary contains a brief reference to large, hair-covered beings observed near the tree line, creatures that moved upright and disappeared quickly into the forest. The entry is matter-of-fact, almost incidental, as if the writer was noting something notable but not unprecedented. Through the 1800s, similar accounts accumulated in the journals and letters of fur traders, explorers, and early settlers moving through the Pacific Northwest and the interior of British Columbia. A Hudson's Bay Company trader named David Thompson is often cited in this context. In 1811, travelling through what is now Alberta, Thompson came across a set of enormous tracks in the snow. He measured them and recorded his findings in his journal. 14 inches long, 8 inches wide, with a stride suggesting a creature of considerable size and weight. Thompson did not know what to make of the tracks. He recorded them carefully and continued on his way. What is notable about Thompson's account and others like it from this period is their tone. These were practical men, accustomed to the wilderness, not given to fantasy. They recorded what they found without embellishment, but also without easy explanation. The tracks were there. Something had made them. What that something was, they could not say. By the late 1800s, logging and mining operations were pushing deeper into the forests of the Pacific Northwest than ever before. Men were spending months at a time in remote camps, far from towns, surrounded by old-growth forest that had barely been touched, and the accounts continued. Strange sounds in the night, shadows moving at the edge of firelight, food stolen from camps, objects moved or disturbed in ways that could not be attributed to bears or other known animals. Most of these accounts never made it into print. The men who experienced them often kept quiet, aware that such stories invited ridicule. But among themselves, in the particular community of men who worked the deep woods, knowledge of something unusual living in the forests was not considered remarkable. It was simply part of the landscape. One more thing to be aware of, like the weather or the terrain. This is perhaps the most striking aspect of the pre-20th century history of Bigfoot. It was not a mystery that needed to be constructed or publicized. It was already there, quietly present in the traditions of those who knew the land best. The indigenous peoples who had lived alongside whatever this creature was for countless generations. The trappers and traders who had followed them into the wilderness. The loggers who had pushed deeper still. The mystery was old. The world that would make it famous was still taking shape. In the summer of 1958, a road construction crew was working in a remote stretch of forest in Humboldt County, in the far north of California. The area is called Bluff Creek, a narrow valley carved by a fast-moving stream, surrounded by steep, heavily forested ridges. Even today, it is not an easy place to reach. In 1958, it was about as isolated as any inhabited part of California could be. The crew was building a logging road, pushing it deeper into the wilderness mile by mile, and they were living in a work camp at the end of the line. The work was hard and the days were long, and for the most part, unremarkable. But sometime in late August, a bulldozer operator named Jerry Crew arrived at his machine one morning and found something he had not expected. Around the bulldozer, pressed into the soft earth of the construction site, were a series of large footprints. Very large. The prints were clearly human in their general shape, a heel, an arch, 5 toes, but they measured nearly 16 inches from heel to toe. They showed a stride of roughly 5 to 6 feet. Whatever had made them had walked upright and had been moving with considerable weight. Jerry Crew was not a man easily rattled. He had worked in the wilderness for years and was familiar with its rhythms and its inhabitants. He examined the prints carefully. They were not bear tracks. Bears do not walk upright with a human gait, and their paws do not produce prints shaped like this. They were not the tracks of any animal he recognized, and they were fresh. Crew mentioned what he had found to his colleagues. It turned out he was not the only one who had noticed unusual tracks in the area. Other members of the crew had seen similar prints in the days before, but had said nothing, unsure how to explain what they were seeing and reluctant to invite skepticism. Now, with a fresh set of clear impressions in the earth, the discovery felt harder to dismiss. Crew decided to make a cast of one of the prints. He mixed up a batch of plaster of Paris and carefully filled the impression, waiting for it to set before lifting it free. The result was a solid, clear record of something that had no obvious explanation. A footprint nearly 1.5 feet long, with the proportions and structure of a human foot, scaled up to a size that no human being could account for. He brought the cast to his wife, and she encouraged him to take it to the local newspaper. The Humboldt Times ran the story on the 5th of October, 1958. The reporter, Andrew Genzoli, used a word in his article that would stick. He called the creature, based on the size of the prints it had left behind, Bigfoot. The name was simple, almost accidental, a journalist's shorthand that captured something essential about the encounter. But it spread quickly. Within days, the story had been picked up by wire services and was running in newspapers across the country. By the end of the week, Bluff Creek was receiving visitors it had never seen before. Curious people, reporters, and a new kind of individual that had not previously had a name, the Bigfoot investigator. Among those who came to Bluff Creek in the weeks that followed was a man named Tom Slick, a Texas oil millionaire with a genuine interest in unexplained phenomena. Slick had previously funded expeditions to the Himalayas in search of the Yeti, the large unknown creature reported by Sherpa communities in Nepal, and he recognized in the Bluff Creek story the same essential shape: credible witnesses, physical evidence, a remote location, and a mystery that conventional science had not addressed. He quietly began organizing what would become one of the first formal searches for Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest. Slick brought in trackers, researchers, and outdoor specialists. The searches were conducted over several years, concentrated in the forests of Northern California and Southern Oregon. They found tracks, collected samples, interviewed witnesses, but they did not find the creature itself. Slick died in a plane crash in 1962, and his Bigfoot research, much of it conducted in private, largely dissolved with him. Some of his files and correspondence survived and have been studied by later researchers. They reveal a man who took the question seriously, who approached it with methodical care, and who died without an answer. Back in Humboldt County, the construction crew continued their work. More tracks were found in subsequent weeks at various points along the road. Some were photographed, some were cast. The prints were not all identical. They showed slight variations in size and shape, suggesting more than one individual, or possibly changes in terrain and gait. This detail, noted carefully by those examining the evidence, complicated the idea that the whole thing was a simple hoax. A single person staging footprints might produce consistent fakes. The variability in the Bluff Creek prints suggested something less controlled, less deliberate. For years after the original story broke, the area around Bluff Creek remained a focal point for Bigfoot research. The forest there is dense and steep, cut through by streams that run cold year-round. It is the kind of place that feels, even in daylight, like it is keeping something from you. Researchers who spent time there in the years following the 1958 discovery often described the same experience: a pervasive sense of being observed, of movement at the edges of their vision, of sounds they could not quite locate or identify. Whether that sense reflected something real or simply the way that deep wilderness affects the human mind is difficult to say. The forest does that to people. It presses on the senses in ways that are hard to account for. What the 1958 discovery accomplished, more than anything else, was to give the mystery a name and a shape that the modern world could engage with. Bigfoot was no longer a collection of isolated local accounts. Indigenous traditions here, a trapper's journal entry there. It was now a national story, with physical evidence that anyone could examine, and a location that anyone could visit. The plaster cast that Jerry Crew made on that late August morning in the California wilderness was not proof of anything. It was a question, large, clearly formed, pressed deep into the earth, and it was a question that, once asked loudly enough, the world could not stop trying to answer. 9 years after that morning at Bluff Creek, in a forest not far from the same valley, 2 men on horseback would point a camera at something moving through the trees. What they captured, or claimed to capture, would become the most scrutinized piece of film footage in the history of the mystery. On the 20th of October, 1967, 2 men rode into the forest along Bluff Creek on a horseback. Their names were Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin. Patterson was a rodeo rider from Yakima, Washington, who had become deeply interested in Bigfoot over the preceding years. He had written a self-published book on the subject and had made several previous trips into the Pacific Northwest in search of evidence. Gimlin was his friend and riding companion, a skilled outdoorsman who was more skeptical of the whole enterprise, but willing to accompany Patterson into the wilderness. They were in the Bluff Creek area specifically because of the history of sightings and track discoveries there. Patterson had obtained a 16mm handheld camera before the trip, with the intention of documenting whatever they might find. He had borrowed money to buy it. This detail, the borrowed camera, the long-held hope of finally finding something, gives the events of that afternoon a particular texture. Patterson had been looking for a long time. What happened next has been examined, debated, and scrutinized more thoroughly than perhaps any other sequence of events in the history of unexplained phenomena. The 2 men were riding along the creek when their horses suddenly spooked. Patterson's horse reared and threw him, and as he scrambled to his feet, he saw, roughly 150 feet away, a large, dark figure moving along the creek bank. He grabbed the camera from his saddlebag and ran toward it, filming as he went. The footage he captured lasts approximately 59 seconds. It shows a large, hair-covered figure walking upright along the edge of the creek, moving away from the camera and into the tree line. At one point, the figure turns and looks directly at the camera, a moment that has been freeze-framed and studied countless times in the decades since. Then it continues walking and disappears into the trees. Patterson and Gimlin examined the area afterward. They found a trail of large footprints pressed into the soft soil along the creek bank, consistent with the figure's path through the frame. Patterson made plaster casts of several of the prints. He was visibly shaken by what had happened. Gimlin, who had watched the encounter from further back, his hand on the rifle holstered at his side, had not fired. He later said it had not seemed right to do so, that the creature had not threatened them, that it had simply walked away. The footage became known as the Patterson-Gimlin film, and within weeks of its recording, it was being shown to researchers, journalists, and scientists across North America. The reaction was immediate and divided. Many people who watched the film felt instinctively that they were looking at something real. The figure moved with a fluidity and a physical mass that seemed difficult to fake. Its proportions were unusual, the shoulders extraordinarily broad, the arms notably long relative to the body, the gait a kind of rolling, weight-bearing walk that did not resemble the way a human being moves. There was, for many viewers, a quality to the footage that was hard to articulate but hard to dismiss. The creature looked heavy. It looked like it belonged in that landscape. Researchers who studied the film more technically noted several details that complicated simple explanations. The figure's stride length and cadence, combined with the apparent size of its footprints, suggested a creature weighing somewhere between 600 and 800 pounds, far beyond any human being in a costume. The muscle movement visible beneath the hair covering, particularly in the thigh and buttock region, appeared to correspond to the mechanics of a very large bipedal animal walking under considerable body weight. Some analysts argued that no human performer in a suit could replicate this movement convincingly, particularly in 1967, with the costume technology available at the time. Others were less convinced. Skeptics pointed out that the film was shot by the one man who most wanted to find Bigfoot, a significant bias. The footage was shaky and often out of focus. The figure was never close enough to the camera for definitive analysis, and the fundamental problem remained. A film of something walking away through a forest could never, by itself, prove what that something was. Bob Gimlin largely withdrew from the public conversation around the film for many years after 1967. He had not sought fame, and he found the relentless debate around the footage uncomfortable. He gave few interviews and attended almost no public events related to Bigfoot for decades. In later years, he became somewhat more open, attending conferences and speaking about his recollections of that afternoon. His account has never substantially changed. He saw what he saw. He has consistently maintained that the figure was not a man in a costume, and that nothing about the encounter suggested a hoax. He was there, he says. He knows what it looked like. Whatever explanation people choose to accept, he is not the one who is wrong. Roger Patterson died of cancer in 1972, 5 years after the filming. He maintained until his death that the footage was genuine, that he had not staged it, that there was no costume, that what the camera captured was real. He died without seeing the question resolved. In the years and decades that followed, the Patterson-Gimlin film became something of a cultural touchstone, endlessly reproduced, endlessly analysed, endlessly debated. It has been examined by costume designers, primatologists, biomechanics experts, and film analysts. Each new examination has tended to produce a new conclusion, and the conclusions have rarely agreed with one another. In 2004, a man named Bob Hieronymus claimed publicly that he had worn a specially made gorilla suit in the footage, that he had been the figure walking along the creek, paid by Patterson to participate in a staged hoax. His claim generated considerable attention, but investigators who examined the details of his account found significant inconsistencies, and no suit was ever produced. The filmmaker and costume designer Bill Munns spent years conducting a technical analysis of the footage and concluded that no suit available in 1967 could have produced the movement and proportions visible in the film. Hieronymus's claim was never confirmed. The film remains unresolved. After nearly 60 years of analysis, no one has conclusively proven it a hoax, and no one has conclusively proven it genuine. It exists in a kind of permanent suspension, 59 seconds of grainy, shaky film that shows something walking away, turning once to look back and disappearing into the trees. Whatever it was, it left those trees a long time ago. The question it left behind has not moved at all. Science by its nature is cautious. It moves by evidence, by things that can be measured, repeated, and independently verified. A footprint in the mud is interesting. A blurry film is interesting. Witness testimony, however sincere, is interesting. But none of these things, on their own, constitute proof in the scientific sense. And in the absence of proof, a body, a bone, a live specimen, something concrete and examinable, mainstream science has largely declined to treat Bigfoot as a serious subject of inquiry. This is not unreasonable. Scientists are not obligated to investigate every claimed phenomenon, and the history of science includes many examples of popular beliefs that turned out to have no basis in physical reality. Caution is a virtue. The reluctance to chase what might be a cultural myth rather than a biological fact is not closed-mindedness. It is, in most cases, simply good practice. And yet the question of Bigfoot is not quite so easy to set aside as it might first appear. A small number of credentialed researchers have, over the decades, looked carefully at the accumulated evidence and found it more substantial than the scientific mainstream has been willing to acknowledge. Their work has not resolved the mystery, but it has complicated the simple dismissal. One of the first scientists to take the Bigfoot question seriously was a primatologist named John Napier. Napier was not a fringe figure. He was a highly respected researcher who served as director of primate biology at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. In 1973, he published a book called Bigfoot, The Yeti and Sasquatch in Myth and Reality, in which he examined the available evidence with the tools of his discipline. Napier's conclusions were carefully balanced. He found much of the claimed evidence unconvincing, and he identified clear problems with several high-profile cases, including inconsistencies in the Bluff Creek track record that suggested at least some footprints in that area had been fabricated. But he stopped well short of dismissing the entire phenomenon. The Patterson-Gimlin film, he wrote, troubled him. He could not identify a clear mechanism by which it had been faked, and the sheer volume and geographic spread of sightings reports, thousands of accounts from across North America, many from people with no apparent motive for fabrication, suggested to him that something was driving the phenomenon, even if that something remained undefined. His conclusion was essentially a question, not Bigfoot does not exist, but we do not yet have enough evidence to say what is happening here. A more direct scientific engagement came from Grover Krantz, a physical anthropologist at Washington State University who became one of the most prominent academic voices in Bigfoot research from the 1970s until his death in 2002. Krantz was unusual in his willingness to stake his professional reputation on the subject. He examined footprint casts in detail, applied his knowledge of primate anatomy and biomechanics, and argued that the best examples showed features consistent with a large, unknown bipedal primate. Features that would have been difficult or impossible for a hoaxer to fabricate without detailed knowledge of foot anatomy that most people simply did not possess. In particular, Krantz pointed to what he called the dermal ridges visible in some of the higher quality casts, fine details in the skin of the foot, analogous to fingerprints, that showed patterns consistent with primate anatomy. He argued that faking such details convincingly would require expertise well beyond what a casual hoaxer could be expected to have, and that the patterns observed were consistent across casts taken in different locations and different years. Krantz paid a price for his convictions. He was regarded with skepticism and sometimes open ridicule by colleagues who felt he had compromised his scientific credibility by associating himself with what they considered a topic unworthy of serious attention. He was denied research funding. He found certain professional doors closed to him. He continued his work regardless and maintained his position until the end of his life. Whether he was right is still an open question, but his engagement with the evidence was rigorous and technically detailed, and dismissing it requires engaging with the specifics of his analysis. Something his critics did not always do. The broader scientific reluctance to engage with Bigfoot rests on a foundational argument that is worth examining directly. North America is a large continent, but it is not an unexplored one. It has been surveyed, mapped, logged, hunted, and studied for centuries. The idea that a large primate, potentially many individuals, given the geographic spread of sightings, could exist across this landscape without ever leaving behind a body, a skeleton, or a clear photograph seems to many scientists implausible to the point of impossibility. This is a reasonable objection. It deserves a reasonable answer. Researchers who take Bigfoot seriously have offered several. Large animals do in fact die without their remains being easily found. particularly in dense forest environments where scavengers work quickly and acidic soil breaks down bone in a matter of years. The forests of the Pacific Northwest and the vast wilderness stretches of the interior are in many places genuinely remote and seldom visited. A creature that was rare, elusive, and, as some researchers have suggested, possibly quite intelligent in its avoidance of human contact, might plausibly leave a very light footprint on the archaeological and biological record. None of this constitutes proof, but it does suggest that the absence of a body is not, by itself, the end of the argument. In 2012, a geneticist named Melba Ketchum published the results of a 5-year DNA study she claimed was based on samples submitted by Bigfoot researchers from across North America. Hair, tissue, and other biological material that witnesses associated with the creature. Her conclusions were dramatic. She claimed the samples showed evidence of a novel hominin, a previously unknown human-related species produced, she theorized, by a hybridization event between a human female ancestor and an unknown male primate, occurring perhaps 15,000 years ago. The scientific reception was largely negative. The study had been published in a journal that Ketchum herself had purchased the rights to after mainstream journals declined it, and independent researchers who examined the data found serious methodological problems. Several of the samples appear to have been contaminated with human DNA, and others matched known animals. The consensus among geneticists was that the study did not support the conclusions drawn from it. Ketchum's research did not prove the existence of Bigfoot, but it did illustrate something important about the state of the field. The evidence that researchers were working with was of genuinely mixed quality, and the tools for analysing it were advancing rapidly. The question of what a rigorous, well-funded scientific examination of the best available evidence might find had not yet been definitively answered. It still has not. Science has not closed the door on Bigfoot so much as it has declined, for the most part, to open it. The reasons for this are understandable, even defensible, but the question remains. Patient, persistent, pressed into the earth like a large footprint waiting to be measured. There is a particular quality to the accounts of people who believe they have encountered Bigfoot. It is not the quality of excitement or of someone who has found what they were looking for. It is closer to the quality of someone who has had something happen to them that they did not ask for and cannot fully explain, a disruption of their understanding of what the world contains. Many witnesses describe the experience in similar terms: a moment of absolute clarity followed by a long period of uncertainty. They know what they saw, they are not sure what it means. The Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, founded in the 1990s, maintains a publicly accessible database of sightings reports from across North America. As of recent years, it contains well over 5,000 entries, each submitted by a named individual and reviewed for plausibility before being included. The reports span every decade from the early 20th century to the present, and they come from every kind of person: hunters, hikers, farmers, police officers, truck drivers, scientists, and ordinary families on camping trips. They come from nearly every state in the continental United States and from every province of Canada. They describe encounters that range from a glimpse at the edge of a tree line to prolonged close observations lasting several minutes. No single sighting proves anything, but the aggregate of thousands of independent accounts, spread across more than a century, carries a weight that is difficult to simply wave away. One of the most frequently cited sightings in the literature involves a man named William Rowe, a Canadian highway worker with a reputation for reliability and careful observation. In October of 1955, Rowe was hunting alone on Meeker Mountain in British Columbia when he observed a large, hair-covered figure moving through the brush approximately 300 feet away. He watched it for several minutes through his rifle scope. Rowe's description was unusually detailed. He estimated the creature stood around 6 feet tall and weighed perhaps 300 pounds, smaller than many reported Bigfoot, which made his account seem less sensational and perhaps more credible. He described the figure as female, noting broad hips and what appeared to be mammary glands beneath the chest hair. The creature moved with fluid, unhurried confidence, pausing occasionally to strip leaves from low-hanging branches and place them in her mouth. She appeared, Rowe said, completely unconcerned by his presence, as if a man with a rifle crouching in the undergrowth was simply not a significant feature of her environment. At one point she turned and looked directly at him. He described her face as almost human in structure, with a broad flat nose and deep-set eyes. Then she turned away and walked into the trees. Rowe said he had raised his rifle to shoot, then lowered it. It had not felt right, he said. It had felt too much like shooting a person. He submitted his account as a sworn affidavit. He had nothing to gain from the disclosure, and he maintained it unchanged for the rest of his life. In 1967, the same year as the Patterson-Gimlin film, a young woman named Sandra Snyder was driving with her family through a forested stretch of highway in northern Washington state when something stepped onto the road ahead of their car. Her father braked hard. In the headlights, clearly visible for several seconds before it crossed to the other side and disappeared into the trees, was a large, upright figure covered in dark hair. The family sat in silence for a moment. Then her father drove on without speaking. Snyder did not report the encounter publicly for nearly 30 years. She had been a child at the time, and she had absorbed the lesson that such things were not spoken about. When she did eventually describe what she had seen, she was precise about the details. The height, the gait, the colour of the hair, the way it moved without any suggestion of hurry. She was also clear about what the experience had cost her. Decades of a vague, unresolved feeling that the world was slightly different from what other people seemed to believe it was. Her account is representative of a much larger pattern in the sighting record. A significant number of witnesses do not come forward immediately, or at all. The social cost of reporting an encounter with Bigfoot is real. It invites ridicule, and it invites the implication that the witness is either dishonest or unstable. Many people choose to carry the experience privately rather than subject themselves to that response. Not all accounts are from lone witnesses. Group sightings, encounters involving multiple people simultaneously, appear throughout the record and carry a different evidentiary weight. When several individuals, with no chance for prior coordination, describe the same thing independently, the possibility of fabrication becomes more complicated. In the summer of 1973, a group of 4 Forest Service workers in the Cascade Range of Oregon reported seeing a large, dark figure standing at the edge of a clear-cut area approximately 200 feet from their position. They watched it for nearly a minute before it turned and walked into the trees. All 4 men gave independent descriptions that were consistent with one another and consistent with the standard account of Bigfoot. Height between 7 and 8 feet, covered in dark brown hair, moving upright with a long, swinging stride. None of the 4 had a camera. They filed a report with their supervisor, who did not know what to do with it. It eventually made its way into the database maintained by later researchers. There are also the night encounters, experiences that involve sound rather than sight, and that carry their own particular character. People who have spent time in the forests of the Pacific Northwest describe, sometimes with considerable unease, a sound they cannot attribute to any known animal. A deep, resonant call, not a howl, not a roar, but something between the two, that carries enormous distances through the trees and seems to come from something with very large lungs. Some researchers have recorded audio that they attribute to this sound, and it has been submitted to sound analysts over the years. No definitive identification has been made. Those who have heard it in person tend to describe it in similar terms. It is not frightening exactly, but it is arresting. It stops you. It makes the forest feel much older and much larger and much less knowable than it did before. What to make of all these accounts is not a simple question. Misidentification is real. Bears, particularly when seen briefly and at a distance, can create impressions that the mind fills in with something more dramatic. Memory is unreliable, and the desire to have seen something remarkable can shape recollection in subtle ways. Some witnesses are undoubtedly mistaken, and some may be dishonest, but the volume, consistency, and geographic spread of the sighting record suggests that these explanations, even taken together, do not account for everything. Something is generating these reports, has been generating them without significant interruption for more than a century. What that something is remains the question at the heart of this long, unresolved, quietly persistent mystery. Every mystery leaves something behind, a residue, a trace, something that persists after the encounter is over and the witness has gone home and the forest has returned to its ordinary quiet. In the case of Bigfoot, the residue has accumulated over decades. Plaster casts, hair samples, audio recordings, and a handful of other physical materials that researchers have collected, preserved, and submitted to analysis. None of it has settled the question, but some of it has proven genuinely difficult to explain. The most abundant form of physical evidence is also the most straightforward, the footprint. Since Jerry Crew made his first cast at Bluff Creek in 1958, researchers have collected hundreds of plaster impressions from locations scattered across North America. The best of these are stored in universities, private collections, and research archives. They vary in size, in detail, and in the conditions under which they were found. Some are almost certainly fakes. Others have attracted serious scientific attention. Grover Krantz, the Washington State University anthropologist who spent much of his career examining this evidence, identified a subset of casts he considered particularly compelling. What interested him most was not simply the size of the prints, though many measured between 14 and 18 inches in length, but the anatomical details they contained. The distribution of pressure across the sole, visible in the depth and shape of the impression, suggested a creature with a body weight far exceeding any human being. The mid-tarsal break visible in some of the casts, a flexibility in the middle of the foot not present in modern humans, but present in some non-human primates, was, Krantz argued, something a hoaxer would be very unlikely to incorporate deliberately, since it required a specific knowledge of primate foot anatomy that most people simply do not have. The dermal ridges found in a number of high-quality casts attracted separate attention. A fingerprint analyst named Jimmy Chilcutt, who had spent his career with law enforcement and had no prior interest in Bigfoot, examined several casts in the late 1990s after initially approaching the subject with skepticism. What he found surprised him. The ridge patterns in the casts showed characteristics consistent with primate skin, but distinct from human fingerprints in ways that he found difficult to attribute to fabrication. The ridges ran in directions and formations he had not seen before. His conclusion was that the casts had been made from real feet. Feet that did not belong to any known animal. Chilcutt's analysis has not been universally accepted. Other experts have raised questions about his methodology, and the casts he examined have not been made available for wide independent study. But his background and his initial skepticism lend his account a credibility that is hard to entirely dismiss. Hair samples have been a recurring feature of Bigfoot investigations since the 1960s. Researchers have collected strands of coarse, dark hair from branches, fence posts, and undergrowth at locations associated with sightings or track finds. These samples have been submitted to laboratories over the years with varying results. The majority have been identified as belonging to known animals: bear, deer, elk, and in some cases human beings. A smaller number have returned inconclusive results, meaning analysts could not match the sample to any species in their reference collection. Inconclusive is not the same as unknown. It may simply mean the sample was degraded or that the reference collection used was incomplete. But it is also not a clean dismissal. In 2014, a geneticist at Oxford University named Brian Sykes conducted a rigorous study of hair samples submitted from across North America and Asia by Bigfoot and Yeti researchers. His methodology was careful and his laboratory work was thorough. The results, published in a peer-reviewed journal, identified all but a handful of the samples as belonging to known species. 2 samples from the Himalayan region produced an unexpected result. They matched most closely with DNA from an ancient polar bear specimen, suggesting a possible unknown bear hybrid in that region. The North American samples did not produce a comparable anomaly. Sykes was clear that his study had not proven Bigfoot's non-existence. He had only tested the samples he was given, and the quality of those samples was uneven. The study was a meaningful contribution to the evidence base, but it was not the final word. Among the most unusual items in the physical evidence record is a collection of audio recordings made by a researcher named Ron Moorhead in the early 1970s in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. Moorhead and a group of companions made repeated visits to a remote campsite where they had been experiencing what appeared to be Bigfoot activity: tracks, disturbed food supplies, and nighttime sounds of unknown origin. Over several trips, they recorded hours of audio that captured a range of unusual vocalizations: deep whooping calls, rhythmic knocking sounds that appeared to be made by something striking trees or logs, and what Moorhead described as a kind of complex guttural language, sounds that suggested communication between more than one animal, with a range of pitch and modulation beyond what most known animals produce. The recordings became known as the Sierra Sounds, and they have been analysed by several researchers over the years. A linguist and cryptologist named R. Scott Nelson studied them in detail and concluded that they showed structural characteristics consistent with a language, not human language, but a system of vocalizations complex enough to suggest intentional communication. His analysis was not published in a peer-reviewed journal, and it has not been independently verified. But the recordings themselves remain unexplained. No one has convincingly identified the source of the sounds, and no known animal in the Sierra Nevada has been shown to produce vocalizations of comparable complexity and range. Taken individually, each piece of physical evidence has a counter-argument. The footprints could be faked. The hair could be misidentified. The audio could be a known animal recorded under unusual conditions. These are all reasonable possibilities, and they should be taken seriously. But what strikes many researchers who work in this field is not any single piece of evidence. It is the pattern. Consistent footprint morphology across locations separated by thousands of miles and decades of time. Hair samples that return inconclusive results from multiple independent labs. Audio recordings that analysts struggle to attribute to any known source. Taken together, they suggest a phenomenon that is generating physical traces in the real world. Something that is not simply a product of imagination or folklore, but is leaving marks on the landscape that instruments can detect. What is leaving those marks remains the question. and it is, by any honest measure, still open. Any honest account of the Bigfoot mystery has to spend time in uncomfortable territory, because for every compelling sighting, for every carefully analysed footprint cast, for every unexplained audio recording, there is a countervailing fact that cannot be ignored. Some of it has been faked, deliberately, cynically, and in some cases quite skillfully. The history of Bigfoot hoaxing is long enough and well documented enough that it deserves the same careful attention as the genuine evidence. Not because it disproves the mystery, but because it has shaped how the mystery is understood and misunderstood. The most significant confession in the history of Bigfoot hoaxing came in 2002 from a man named Ray Wallace. Wallace was a road contractor who had worked in Humboldt County in the late 1950s, the same area, the same era as the Bluff Creek footprint discovery that launched Bigfoot into public consciousness. When Wallace died in November of 2002, his family announced publicly that he had been responsible for the original Bluff Creek tracks. They produced a pair of large carved wooden feet, roughly 16 inches long, which they said Wallace had used to stamp the prints into the earth around the construction site. The story was reported widely, and many outlets treated it as a definitive resolution. The headline wrote itself: "The man who invented Bigfoot was dead. Case closed." But researchers who examined the claim carefully found it considerably less conclusive than it appeared. The Wallace family's account contained inconsistencies. The wooden feet they produced did not match the morphology of the original Bluff Creek casts in several important ways. The toe spacing, the arch profile, and the pressure distribution visible in the original prints did not correspond to what a flat carved board would produce. And Wallace himself, who had been a well-known prankster and self-promoter throughout his life, had made numerous exaggerated claims over the years that had not held up to scrutiny. None of this meant the original Bluff Creek prints were genuine, but the Wallace confession on examination was not the clean resolution it had seemed. It was one more layer of ambiguity in a story already full of them. The most consequential hoax revelation in Bigfoot history came not from a deathbed confession, but from a careful piece of investigative research. In the 1990s, a journalist named Greg Long spent years investigating the Patterson-Gimlin film, interviewing dozens of people connected to Roger Patterson's life and work. His research, published in 2004 in a book called The Making of Bigfoot, built a circumstantial case that the film had been staged, that Patterson had hired a man to wear a costume and had orchestrated the encounter at Bluff Creek. The central figure in Long's account was Bob Hieronymus, the man who claimed to have worn the suit. Hieronymus described the costume, the filming, and his agreement with Patterson in considerable detail. His account attracted significant attention and was accepted by a number of journalists and commentators as effectively settling the question. But the problems with Hieronymus's account were real and have never been satisfactorily resolved. He could not produce the suit or any part of it. His physical measurements, height, arm length, stride, did not match the proportions visible in the film. And the technical analyses conducted by researchers like Bill Munns, who spent years building detailed scale models and examining every frame of the footage, consistently concluded that the figure in the film could not have been a human being in any costume available in 1967. Munns was not a Bigfoot believer in the conventional sense. He was a professional filmmaker and model maker who approached the analysis as a technical problem, and his conclusion was based on geometry and physics rather than faith. The Hieronymus claim remains unproven. It has not been independently verified, and the film has not been debunked in any way that satisfies researchers who have examined it most closely. Beyond specific hoaxes, there is the broader skeptical argument. the position that the entire Bigfoot phenomenon can be accounted for without reference to an unknown creature. This argument has several components, each of which deserves consideration. Misidentification is almost certainly responsible for a significant portion of sighting reports. Bears, seen briefly, at distance, in poor light, can produce impressions that memory reshapes into something more dramatic. The human mind is not a neutral recording device. It is a pattern recognition system, and it sometimes finds patterns that are not there, particularly in conditions of stress, excitement, or uncertainty. A large dark shape moving through trees can become, in retrospect, exactly what the mind was primed to see. There is also the role of cultural suggestion. Bigfoot is one of the most widely known figures in North American popular culture. Anyone who spends time in the forest has almost certainly encountered the idea before they encounter anything in the trees. This does not mean all witnesses are simply imagining things, but it does mean that the cultural context in which an ambiguous experience occurs can shape how it is interpreted and remembered. And there is the straightforward dishonesty of some claimants, people who have fabricated tracks, staged photographs, or invented encounters for attention, financial gain, or simple amusement. This has happened. It continues to happen. It is one of the genuine difficulties facing anyone who wants to investigate the phenomenon seriously. What the skeptical argument does not fully account for is the consistency and geographic spread of the record. Misidentification and cultural suggestion can explain individual cases. They struggle to explain why accounts from people with no connection to one another, describing encounters in locations separated by thousands of miles, contain the same specific details: the height, the gait, the smell, the sound, in report after report across more than a century. The honest position is not that hoaxes prove Bigfoot does not exist, nor is it that unexplained evidence proves that it does. The honest position is that the record is mixed, contaminated by fabrication in some places, unexplained in others, and that separating one from the other, with the tools currently available, has not yet been possible. The skeptics are right that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The evidence so far has not reached that threshold, but the question of whether the phenomenon has been thoroughly enough investigated to justify confident dismissal is one that even careful skeptics have found difficult to answer with certainty. The world that Roger Patterson rode into on horseback in 1967 was a different world from the one we inhabit now. He carried a borrowed camera and a hand-drawn map. Communication with the outside world required driving to a town with a telephone. The forest was, in a very practical sense, beyond the reach of most of the technology that existed at the time. If something was out there, it had a great deal of space in which to remain hidden. That has changed, though perhaps not as completely as one might expect. The forests of the Pacific Northwest are still vast, still remote, and still capable of concealing things that do not wish to be found. But the tools available to researchers have advanced in ways that Patterson could not have imagined, and the application of those tools to the Bigfoot question over the past 2 decades has produced results that are genuinely interesting, even if they have not yet produced the definitive answer that everyone on every side of the debate is waiting for. Trail cameras were among the first technologies to be widely deployed in the search. Small, motion-activated, designed for wildlife monitoring, these devices can be left unattended in the forest for weeks or months, recording whatever moves past them. Bigfoot researchers began placing them at locations with a history of reported activity in the early 2000s, and the practice has expanded considerably since then. Hundreds of cameras have been deployed across North America, in forests from northern California to the Appalachians to the boreal wilderness of Canada. The results have been, for the most part, a catalogue of the forest's known inhabitants, Bears, deer, elk, mountain lions, and a wide range of smaller animals have all been captured in abundance. Occasionally, a blurry image or an unusual silhouette generates brief excitement before being identified as something mundane. No trail camera has yet produced a clear, unambiguous image of a large, unknown bipedal creature. This is significant. It does not prove the creature does not exist, but it does raise questions about the density of its population, the range of its territory, and the likelihood of any given camera being in the right place at the right time. A rare, wide-ranging animal covering many miles of difficult terrain might pass a fixed camera location only occasionally, or never. The forest is large. The cameras, numerous as they have become, cover only a small fraction of it. Environmental DNA, or eDNA, is a more recent and more promising technology. The principle is straightforward. Any animal moving through an environment leaves behind biological material. Shed skin cells, hair, saliva, waste that contains genetic information. Scientists can collect water or soil samples from a given area and extract whatever DNA is present, then compare it against known species to identify what animals have been there without ever seeing the animals themselves. The technique has been used successfully to detect rare and elusive species in habitats across the world, from mountain lakes to dense rainforests. Researchers interested in Bigfoot have begun applying eDNA methodology to areas with a history of reported activity. The work is in its early stages, and published results are limited. Some samples have returned unusual results that have not been fully explained. Others have shown nothing unexpected. The challenge is that eDNA degrades relatively quickly in the environment, and the quality of the results depends heavily on the quality of the sampling and the completeness of the genetic databases against which samples are compared. If the creature in question is genuinely unknown, its DNA would not be in any existing database, which means a positive result would show up as an anomaly rather than a match. Finding a meaningful anomaly and knowing what to do with it is the next frontier in this line of research. Acoustic monitoring has also become more sophisticated. Remote recording devices can now be left in the field for extended periods, capturing audio across a wide frequency range. The Sierra Sounds recordings that Ron Moorhead made in the 1970s were produced with basic equipment that captured only a portion of the available sound spectrum. Modern recorders can detect sounds below and above the range of human hearing, infrasound and ultrasound, that earlier equipment would have missed entirely. Some researchers have proposed that the unusual vocalizations associated with Bigfoot may include infrasound components, very low-frequency sounds that are felt as much as heard, and that can cause disorientation, unease, and even visual disturbances in human beings exposed to them. This has been suggested as a partial explanation for why some witnesses describe an overwhelming sense of dread or an urge to flee during encounters, even when the creature itself appears to be behaving passively. The idea is speculative, but it is not without precedent. Infrasound has been documented in the communication of several large animals, including elephants and tigers. Perhaps the most significant development in recent years has been the growth of organised, methodical research efforts that approach the question with genuine scientific discipline. Organisations such as the Olympic Project, operating in the forests of the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state, have developed protocols for evidence collection, documentation, and analysis that meet standards recognisable to mainstream science. They use GPS tracking, systematic survey transects, standardised plaster casting techniques, and chain of custody procedures for biological samples. Their work is careful, patient, and largely unglamorous, the antithesis of the television programs that have made Bigfoot hunting a form of entertainment. The Olympic Project and similar groups have documented track finds, biological samples and audio recordings that they consider compelling. Their evidence has been submitted to independent analysts. The results, as with so much else in this field, have been suggestive rather than conclusive. But the quality of the methodology represents a genuine improvement over the ad hoc investigations of earlier decades, and it has produced a body of documented evidence that will be available for future analysis as technology continues to advance. There is also the possibility, raised by a small number of researchers, that the answer to the Bigfoot question may come not from the Pacific Northwest, but from genetics and paleontology. The fossil record of large primates is incomplete. Gigantopithecus blacki, a massive ape that lived in Asia and may have stood over 9 feet tall, is known only from teeth and jaw fragments. It is thought to have gone extinct several 100,000 years ago, but the fossil record is sparse, and the question of whether a related lineage could have crossed into North America via the land bridge that connected Asia and Alaska during the last ice age has not been conclusively answered. It is the kind of question that a single significant fossil find could transform entirely. The forest keeps its own timeline. It is not in any hurry to answer the questions being asked of it, but the tools pressing into it are sharper now than they have ever been, and the people using them are, in some corners of this field, more rigorous than they have ever been. Whatever the forest contains, the search for it is more serious than the popular image of Bigfoot hunting would suggest. There is a map that was drawn in the early 16th century by a European cartographer who was trying to represent a world that his civilization had only just begun to understand. In the blank spaces at the edges, the places that had not yet been explored, the coastlines that dissolved into uncertainty, he wrote a phrase that has since become one of the most evocative in the history of exploration. Here be dragons. It was not a literal claim, it was an acknowledgement. Here, the known world ends. Here, something else begins. We do not know what it is. We have been filling in those blank spaces ever since. The dragons retreated as the ships pushed further, as the forests were mapped and the mountains were named, and the rivers were traced to their sources. The world became, in the popular imagination, a fully known place. A planet surveyed and catalogued and understood, with no room left for genuine surprises. The age of discovery, we tell ourselves, is over. Bigfoot survives, in part, as a quiet argument against that assumption. Whatever one believes about the creature itself, whether it is a real animal, a misidentification, a cultural myth, or something stranger and harder to categorize, the persistence of the mystery says something meaningful about the relationship between human beings and the natural world. We are drawn to the possibility that something large and unknown still moves through the forests. Not because we want to be frightened, but because the alternative, a world entirely explained, entirely mapped, entirely stripped of the possibility of genuine surprise, is, for many people, a diminished one. The wilderness has always served this function. It has always been the place where the ordinary rules feel slightly less certain, where the boundaries of the known world grow soft. The forests of the Pacific Northwest are among the last places in North America where a person can walk for days without crossing a road, without seeing a structure built by human hands, without encountering the infrastructure of modern life in any form. They are ancient in a way that is difficult to fully absorb. Trees that were old when the first European explorers arrived. Ecosystems that have been evolving for millions of years without reference to human concerns or human timelines. In a landscape like that, the idea that something unknown might exist feels less like fantasy and more like simple humility. The forest does not owe us its complete inventory. The cultural life of Bigfoot is, by now, vast and complicated. The creature has appeared in films, television programs, advertisements, and an enormous range of popular media. It has become a kind of mascot for the American wilderness, simultaneously the subject of serious investigation and a figure of gentle comedy, a presence that people feel free to mock precisely because engaging with it seriously feels risky. The ridicule that attaches to Bigfoot belief has a function. It keeps the question at a comfortable distance, safely categorized as the concern of eccentrics and true believers, rather than something that might require a genuine reckoning. But underneath the cultural noise, the serious question persists. Thousands of people across more than a century have reported seeing something in the forests of North America that they could not identify and could not forget. Physical traces have been found and studied, and in some cases found genuinely difficult to explain. Researchers have spent careers examining the evidence with care and discipline and have declined to simply dismiss it. Indigenous communities have maintained traditions about this presence for longer than written records exist. None of this constitutes proof, but it constitutes something, a persistent, unresolved signal in the noise, a question that the available evidence has not been sufficient to answer in either direction. There is a scientific principle that is sometimes invoked in discussions of Bigfoot and similar mysteries. It is the principle of parsimony, the idea that, all else being equal, the simplest explanation is most likely to be correct. Applied to Bigfoot, the principle suggests that the simplest explanation for thousands of sightings of a large unknown primate is not that a large unknown primate exists, but that people are mistaken, or lying, or influenced by cultural suggestion. The world as we understand it does not contain such a creature. Therefore, it probably does not exist. This is a reasonable application of the principle, but parsimony also has limits. It works best when the phenomenon being explained is simple and well contained. When the phenomenon is complex, widely distributed, persistent across time, and accompanied by physical traces that have not been fully explained, the calculation becomes less straightforward. At some point, accounting for all the evidence without reference to the creature requires an explanation that is itself fairly elaborate. A century of widespread misidentification and fabrication, operating independently across thousands of cases, producing a consistent and specific pattern of reports. Whether that explanation is actually simpler than the alternative is a question worth sitting with. In the end, what Bigfoot offers, regardless of what it ultimately turns out to be, is an invitation. An invitation to take seriously the possibility that the world is not yet fully known, that the edges of the map still contain something, that a forest old enough and large enough and dense enough might hold in its quieter reaches a presence that has not yet been formally introduced to the systems of knowledge that human civilization has built. The people who have seen something in the trees, who have heard the long, resonant call moving through the dark forest, who have found the deep impression in the soft earth and knelt to measure it, did not go looking for a mystery. It found them, and it left them, in most cases, not with certainty, but with a question that has sat with them ever since. A question about what the world contains that we have not yet been shown. That question is, in its own way, a kind of gift. It keeps the forest large. It keeps the map incomplete in at least one corner. It keeps alive the oldest and most honest of human feelings, the feeling of standing at the edge of the known world, and understanding, with something between unease and wonder, that beyond it, something moves. The trees are dark. The creek runs cold, and somewhere in the quiet forest, at the edge of what can be seen and known and named, the question remains.